Hello and welcome to this first video in a series designed to help people with zero knowledge of web development get you the skills you need to create your own websites and web applications from scratch. This series we're going to be learning about the fundamental web building blocks, namely HTML, CSS and JavaScript, and eventually combining these skills to create modern, feature-rich websites. If those terms don't make sense yet, that's fine, as we'll be starting from absolute ground zero and explaining everything. If you already have some basic web development knowledge, you may want to dip in later, as we're going to be starting with some very basic concepts that you're probably already familiar with if you've ever dabbled with making websites in the past. This won't just be a coding follow-along, as I don't think that's a very effective way of learning how what you're doing is actually producing the result. So each video will be starting with a more general explanation about the technologies in that video, the languages, how they work together, and how they fit into the kind of larger development picture. We'll go through that later in more detail, but today let's just get started with day one of our web development journey. So you've probably heard this language before, HTML. That's for good reason. It is the fundamental language that makes up websites, and it stands for Hypertext Markup Language, and it's not a programming language per se, although it is often referred to as such because it's used in the creation of something on computers. Is very similar to making software, but it's in fact a markup language, and what that means is that it's used to give meaning and structure to content. So you have content on the internet, you have images, you have text, you have titles, and you want both your users and the programs that the users use to view your website, such as browsers or other web readers, to know what parts of your content are what. You need the browser to be able to discern what is a title and what is a paragraph of text. Where does that paragraph of text end and the next begin? These sorts of semantic or meaningful differences in your content. So if you think of your website as a house in which you are the architect and the builder in this case, the HTML is the framing. So the framing gives the house structure and meaning. If your frame is 2 stories high, you have a 2-story house. In the same way, your HTML defines what your website is in a way. So you may have heard a bunch of different language names like Ruby or PHP that are used to create websites, and that is true, but by and large most of these languages work by spitting out HTML at the end of the day. So no matter how advanced you get, it's always going to be beneficial to have a really solid grounding in HTML, which is why we're going to start here and why virtually everyone starts here. So this is what HTML looks like. It doesn't have to look like this, but this is by and large the kind of thing you'll see if you look at a basic website's HTML. If you go to any website these days and use one of the tools to view their HTML, in Chrome you can right click and go view source, or F12 and then look in the developer console, you'll probably see something that looks a lot more confusing than this. But it is entirely possible to create a website with HTML as simple as this, and just HTML. You don't need any other language to make a website. That's not to say it's going to be a pretty looking website, but it is possible. So what are we looking at here? We're looking at a bunch of tags, and in between those tags we're looking at the content of those tags. So the tags are anything that are wrapped in the angle brackets. So at the top we can see the angle bracket HTML, and underneath that angle bracket head. And these brackets define, these tags define the start and end of an element. So HTML is defining an HTML element, and if you look right at the bottom you'll see another HTML with a slash in front of it. So that is defining the close of that element. So everything on this page is contained within an HTML element, which is defined by an opening and a closing HTML tag. Tags can be nested, so within that we have another tag, which I've defined by this tabbing, just for your visual aid. The browser or whatever application is consuming this HTML doesn't care about this spacing. That is purely just for the writers of the web page. You can see we've defined a head, and then further nested within that we've defined something called a title. Now don't worry about any of this just yet. This is just to give you an idea of what HTML looks like and give you a sense of this kind of nested structure of elements that lives within it. Because that is really how all the structure is defined. We say this document has a head, and within the head we have a title. And then the browser or whatever application can make sense of that based on rules that it has coded inside it. So let's dive into some coding. Okay, so the first thing I'm going to do is open up Notepad. I'm working on a Windows computer, so Notepad should be installed on all yours if you're working on Windows. Otherwise, if you're on a Mac, you can use TextEdit. But if you have a more advanced program that you prefer using for something else, such as Notepad++, Sublime, or Visual Studio Code, you can go ahead and use that. Any plain text editor will work. Just wanted to show that you could make a website using just the basic text editor that comes with your PC and a browser. So you will obviously need to have a browser installed, but for this video it won't matter which one. I recommend Chrome, but Firefox, Internet Explorer, Safari will be fine. So the first thing I have done is I've file saved as, and I've called the file index.html. So the file type I set to all files, and then just typed in index.html. The reason for this is that a lot of browsers, when they're looking for the default file, so the kind of home page, if you will, or the default file to show first, they'll look for index.html. So it's kind of a convention to make your default name your default page as such. So we've got index.html, and the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to first increase the font size so you can see what I'm typing, and I'm going to do open bracket, exclamation mark, and then in all caps write doctype HTML. Now I'm going to actually leave this for explanation in later videos. Suffice to say that any website you're making these days, you should just put this at the top. It's declaring to the browser that it should interpret what you're about to write as what's known as HTML5. So it's basically saying interpret this HTML as the latest version and render it as such. HTML5 is the latest version, and this is what the exclamation mark. If you look at older websites, you might see them declaring older versions. For now, let's just accept that this is what you should write at the top of your file. And then we're going to open with what you saw in the slide, which is an HTML tag. And then for simplicity, I like to close things as soon as I open them so that you can keep track of where you are. So we now have the document that we're going to send to the browser for rendering. The next thing that all websites have is they have what's known as a head and a body. So I'm going to there's a convention in both programming and web development that when you nest elements or other things in coding, you do either a tab or spaces, and that's just a visual aid so that other people looking at your work or yourself later on can kind of make an easier distinction between elements. So because Notepad tabs are gigantic, I'm just going to use spaces. So I'm going to go 1, 2, and then write open angle bracket head 2 angle bracket slash head, and then I'm going to do the same for body. So this is typically where I'd start for any website that I was building from scratch. So you have the HTML document, and then the majority of your content is going to go in this between these body tags, and some elements that are generally talking more to the browser than to the end user are going to go in the head. We're not going to go through many of these today, except for the one we're going to do right now, which is the title tag. So you'll notice I've put both these tags in one line, and that's because the content of this tag is going to fit on one line. So it just makes it easier visually to see this as one block. Again, this is kind of user preference, but this is how I've always done it. So title, we're going to call this one My First Website. So far amongst all this writing, this is the only kind of content that we've actually written. And as I said, it's within the head, so it's more for the browser to interpret. And as you might imagine, this is what is going to be shown in the top bar when we visit our website. So next we're going to declare some content that we actually want to show up on the page or the main body of the website. So we're going to go into the body and we're going to declare what's known as an H1 tag or a heading tag. Heading tags are a type of tag that are obviously used for titles or headings, and they are graded in both importance and visual size and style from H1 up. So H1 is the most important, then you have H2, H3, H4, H5, and potentially higher if you need to. Most websites would only use up to 5 potentially, and you'll see when we view this website what this actually means. It has more meaning as far as the browser is concerned, in that it interprets whatever is in here as more important than headings of higher values or potentially body content and other things. So we're going to just call this the same as our title, call it My First Website. Getting a bit dyslexic with my spelling of website. And then underneath that we're going to introduce another type of tab, another type of element, sorry, the P tag. And we're going to write Hello Internet. Again, these are all in a single line, and a P tag is short for paragraph. And as you can imagine, it's made for denoting kind of blocks of paragraph content. So the browser will actually, by default, unless we override it, put kind of spaces underneath paragraphs and give it some visual distinction. We can override that later, but we want that for now. So underneath that, we're actually going to get a bit more adventurous now, and we're going to declare an image element. Now this one is a bit more tricky, because now I'm going to show you the first what's known as attribute. So an image by itself, we obviously don't want to, you can't copy and paste kind of the image into the browser. It needs to be represented as a file, and we do that by passing in the location of that file and what's known as an attribute. So this attribute's name is src for source, and then we declare the value of that attribute equals, and then putting it between quotation marks. So the name of this file, which I have saved just from Google image search onto my desktop, and it's living, not on my desktop, sorry, it's living in the same folder as this index.html file. So I have a single folder that houses this HTML file and this image, and that's all that's in it, and it's called waving-hand.png. And then we have some other attributes I want to declare for it. I'm going to declare its width and its height in exactly the same manner, and then put the closing tag at the end. So this is what's known as a self-contained tag. It doesn't have any content per se, because this tag is going to go and retrieve this image and make that its content, and then apply these attributes to it. And the browser is coded to know what to do when it reads the source attribute, this width attribute, and this height attribute, and apply those to the element as such. And that is all for our first website. So we're going to save it. So here is the folder where I've saved both the image and the index.html file. You can see that index.html is being recognized by my system as a website or Chrome HTML document, and that's because we saved it as an HTML file. So we can just double click on this, and here's our website. So as you can see right at the top, we have My First Website, which is the title we declared within our head. Then we have our H1 tag being a header. The browser rather has applied some default styling and made it bolder and larger to make it look like a header. And then underneath we have our one line of paragraph text, which we put between those p tags. And lastly, the image of a 50 by 50 pixel waving hand, which it's pulling straight from that same folder because we just put the file name itself. If that we didn't save that image into the folder beforehand, we'd see a little square with an X saying it could not find the image. And so there we go. That's as simple as it is to create a basic website and then view it on your computer. Obviously you wouldn't be able to go to another computer and type this in because for now the files just live on your computer locally. That's a video much further down the track about hosting, and some of you may already be familiar with that, but for now, congratulations, you've created your first website.